Don't worry about me. I'm going where I always wanted to go. And when I get there, I'll be saying a prayer for all of you.
Last week we talked about the virtue of hope. And we talked about this idea of writing a letter to a person that's been hopeful and been a source of hope in your life. This week, we go to the virtue of love, the great misunderstood virtue of love, that virtue that as men, we sometimes are uncomfortable or feel strange about. Even in times, we don't even use the word because it makes us so scared and so uncomfortable. And what I would like to do is to invite you to think more about people around you when we use this. Because as you see in the life of Father Capon, his men did not like him. His men didn't think he was just a genuinely kind of nice guy. They loved him. And the stories you're going to hear are moments where Father Capon, because of his love for his men, endeared them to the point that they loved him. For me personally, as I've gone further and further into this journey with Father Capon, I've started to see that you can't help but have love if you have faith and hope. We live in a world where love is seen as the use of a person or an object. And as men, a lot of times we fall into that. And so I'd ask you today, as we break open the virtue of love through the lens of Father Capon, that you look into your life and think of the moments where you haven't loved enough or where you need to love more. And as you see Father Capon's love come to life, ask God to give you the ability to love deeper and more profoundly and without counting the cost. I remember reading years ago John Paul II said, or now Pope St. John Paul the Great said, love is the absence of self. I've often thought about the times where I've professed love and it was about me. And so really I profess something different than love. So as we talk about Father Capon today, I encourage you to step into your own life and to look at Father Capon's love for his men. Think about the love that you have for the men that now you've been together for 4 weeks. And then figure out ways that we, as Capon's men, can take this love out of this room and into the world.
Love, to any man, you throw that word out there and they get a little uneasy just, either saying it, receiving it, but, it's not necessarily an action. It's the result of an action. And Father Capon didn't do anything because he wanted to receive love. He didn't go in there saying, well, I'm going to make these guys love me. It's a byproduct of him serving.
He was one of the most selfless people you would ever run into. He was always thinking of others, and I could give you so many examples of how he just sacrificed his own self, even to the very end.
One of the first things that happened to them as they were captured is usually the North Koreans and Chinese would take their boots because their boots were so much better than their own. So many of them were without shoes. The only thing they could do for shoes was to wrap cloth around their feet. It was during this time that Father Capon enlisted the aid of other prisoners. He would be carrying somebody on his back or carrying a stretcher, and as they would be walking along, and he would tell other soldiers that they would have to do the same.
Sometimes he would be helping others, and some of the other GIs would help me for a ways. Then he would come back and check, see where I was, and he would start carrying me then, helping me along on one foot. He wasn't a muscular man. He was a thin man. He was tall, and he might have weighed 170 pounds, but he wasn't muscular. He was all thin. And the strength that man showed to carry me and hop along, and the things that he did, God had to be with him. That's all there was to it.
Dr. Essenson told me this story, and he said, they weren't able to say no to Father Capon. He said, I could go up and tell them they needed to help out, but he said, they would not pay attention to me, but he said they would have to pay attention to Father Capon because all he was doing was asking them to do what he was doing himself. And he said, we only lost about 8 or 9 during that march. He said other units would lose up to 10 or 20% of the men as they were walking to the north. But he said, we didn't because of Father Capon. He said, I cannot imagine how many lives that he saved just in that march to that prison camp.
It was hard not to love somebody who brought you encouragement, who brought you the wherewithal to survive another night in terms of the physical assets, the food, the clothes, if you were in the state somewhere in. For a while, he had tobacco for his pipe, and he'd share a puff on his pipe when he had it. He just did nothing but give. And what he gave was just exactly that. He gave love.
They knew that he had it in for them, that he was there for them, that he was constantly with them, walking alongside them. And I think that his love for Christ just shone through him. And I think that that type of love is something that we all ought to aspire to, all can aspire to. And when we recognize the love of Christ within ourselves, and that is what transpires to other people, it's pretty easy to love the guy back.
When we think about him carrying a soldier miles in the cold, he wasn't just simply carrying a soldier. He was carrying Christ. That's what he was doing. When he was picking lice or when he was tending someone's wounds, he was tending the wounds of Christ. Those eyes, to be able to see Christ in everybody, changes us and it changes the world around us. That's what he had. That's why he was so lovable, in the fact that when you could look at his eyes, and I'm sure those soldiers could look at him and know that they were loved. That's an attraction that everybody's going to take notice of.
The world gives us a really strange view of love, that it's all about what we feel, and a lot, with this passion and sexuality and all these things that are false plays on love. They're almost upside down. When we realize that love is to will the good of another, and to sacrifice for the good of another, and to lay our life down for another, when we try to manifest that, it really is the most manly virtue I can think of. We look at the man, Christ, hanging from the cross. I doubt that he had a lot of butterflies in his stomach going, oh, you guys are so great, as he's hanging there. While at the same time, that was the ultimate act of love. And in the end, that's the same act that Father Capon gave, was to offer his life for his friends, to lay down his life and suffer. So when we talk about love, I think that it's often misplaced, but with a proper frame of mind, it becomes the most manly of virtues.
How often do I really, will the good of another, hoping that they're able to get a position, or hoping that that they feel well? Father Capon willed the good of everybody, and I don't know how he could have done it. I don't know how his capacity was so great for that. Sometimes we find that there's only so many people that fit in my daily bubble or in my life. I can't take on any more. And I think that's where sometimes we start to look in and say, I don't have any more time. I don't have any more energy. I want to go and play golf, or I want to go and do something for me. And that's okay. It's okay. But at the same time, it's all about balance. And if we do that too much, how many opportunities are we really have to really show love? And when I say show love, I think it's building relationships. It's building relationships one person at a time, and really taking a person's personal interest in that person.
If Father Capon had never come across that road to push that guy aside, I'd have been dead. No question in my mind, I'd have been dead right there. That would have been the end of my life. But he didn't. He was a man of God, and God told him to come across there and save my life, which he did. And I have a home in heaven now. I know someday, without a doubt, probably I'll see Father Capon up there.
I can't think of a better role model. He's certainly, for me, an ideal in every respect. When you think of character, you think of loyalty, you think of love, you think of a commitment to our Lord, and willingness to share it in every way he could with those around him. I can't think of any more ideal person to model.
I started this session talking to you about the world and the way world views love, and then I gave you Pope St. John Paul the Great and his view of love. But I think as men, a lot of times we read these things, we hear these things, we see these things, and we wonder, what does it mean to me? How do I live into this? About 8 years ago, I was given an opportunity to see love. My sister, who's older than me, who was married around the same time as me, dealt with a situation which was incredibly challenging for any person. And it was probably tougher for me because it was my sister. Because you see, I watched my sister as she dealt with her husband, the father of her 2 children, who at the time were a kindergartner and a 2nd grader, be diagnosed with cancer. And not just any cancer, stage 4 lung cancer. And I watched as my sister carried this man, walked with this man, but most importantly, loved this man. And 2 days before my brother-in-law went to see God, I was in the hospital with my own brother. And my sister had asked us to sit at the door to kind of keep watch on him. And I'll never forget, about 2 o'clock in the morning the first night, my brother crept the door open where my brother-in-law was as he was taking his last breaths. And my sister was taking care of him. And he got my attention. He goes, "Look." And we both looked into the room. The lights were dim. Everything was low. And all I could see was the silhouette of my sister as she had crawled up in bed with the man of her dreams, the father of her children. And she had taken his hand into her hand. And she'd moved aside all the tubes and the cords, and she had laid her head on his chest and fallen asleep. In that moment, I saw what love looked like. I got to experience love and see it. In some ways, one of the first times in my life. In that hospital that day, I vowed to love my wife deeper, more profoundly, and better than I'd ever loved her before. But not just my wife, my children, and every person I encountered. Because you see, to be a Capon's man means that we love and we don't count the cost. We don't worry about the repercussions. We just love. Because at the end of the day, it is love that changes the world. And Father Capon showed us that by the fact that his men, as they took him to the house of death, sobbed as he left them. So the challenge this week is a bit unique in the challenges we've done so far, because this challenge at first is going to seem to you, you're going to hear it and say, wait a minute, I thought I'm supposed to do something or be something. And as men, a lot of times, that's how we're conditioned. Go do it, feel it, fix it. And this is a little different. The challenge this week is for you to go to your church. If you have perpetual adoration, perfect. Go sit with God, who is love. And while you're in that perpetual adoration chapel, maybe it's 30 minutes. Just sit and allow God to love you. Because many times we come to these groups and we hear these challenges and we do these things and we want to do. And I think around this virtue of love, I want you to allow God just to love you where you are. Because one of the things that I've found that Father Capon knew is that when we allow God to love us where we are, it gives us the ability to love the world where it is. And at the end of the day, what's going to change the world is love.